Here we go. Click. And we're live. We are Kateless for the moment because Kate's back. All right. It is Thursday, December 17th, 2020, 5:02 p.m. I would say the Russians are coming, except that the Russians are really already here. There is no point in pretending that the invasion did not begin a while ago. We're going to talk all about that. We're also going to talk about going dark. A special shout out at the beginning of this episode to Alice Lee, who has been demanding, as part of the audience participation in scheduling the show, demanding Susan Landau's presence on the show for a good long time, and I finally made it happen. A couple of updates. Bob Mueller has successfully now embedded the battle axe in the pineapple in a fashion that I think is stable and will not fall down. There is heavy duty wiring behind that to make
is
that.
There really?
Yeah. No, I've put studs in the wall.
It looks very
It looks like I just propped it up there, but no.
Put
it's
that axe anywhere.
Exactly. No. It's there was a lot of time spent on it, and over the weekend I'm going to route this stuff in, and drill into the wall and make it a little bit more permanent. Look, we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are apparently allowed to have Russian hackers in all of our government systems. And if that sounds appealing to you, great. It's not my cup of tea, but I can't think of a person I would rather talk about it with than Susan Landau, who has been working on cybersecurity and encryption issues for a long, long time. So, Susan, welcome to the show. How bad is it?
Can she hear us?
I don't know.
Now I can hear you. I didn't hear. I just sent mail.
You went out. You went out for a sec. Oh, well, you're back. All right. So,
yeah.
How bad is it?
Yes.
The Russian presence.
How bad is what?
It's
a disaster.
Solar wind stuff.
I like that she doesn't even wait for the answer.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
All right, so walk us through it. What do we know?
Yeah. And is it predictable? So walk it through. They got into a contractor that a lot of the agencies were using. They were inside for 9 months. 6 or 9 months. They were pretty good they were excellent at cleaning up their tracks. So it's hard to know where they've been. And they seemed very professional. They were not about, let's get everything. They were about, let's get the things that really matter to us. We don't know what they left behind.
And what do we know about the classified versus non-classified nature of the target?
I don't know a lot, so I don't want to say. And of course, we also know that people are not as careful as they ought to be, especially right now over the last 9 months by now. So I just don't know.
So what do we know? Can somebody walk me through everything what's been going on with this? I mean, I feel like this has only been the last couple of
we're having
days,
trouble with a stable connection. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
We can hear you just fine. Your video has blinked out, but let's just deal with you as a disembodied.
And at some point, I'll hear from you.
Yeah, we'll deal with you as a disembodied voice.
What do we know? We know they broke into a contractor, and from that contractor, when the contractor's system was uploaded to the various federal agencies that were using that contractor, they were then inside the system, and they were unobserved for months. But wasn't noticed. And it's going to take a long time to figure out what they've had access to, what they've seen, what they've taken. What they've had access to is in many ways almost more important than what they've taken. And of course, what we want to know is what they've left behind as well.
And how?
But it looks like I am not connected to you.
No, you are. We can hear you. How confident are you that this was SVR? I don't think Susan can hear us is the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a delay.
All right. I am going to talk and email Susan at the same time. Let's see. We can hear you.
Do you want to try to
can't
turn her to
us.
audio only to see if there's like we can have
Yeah,
her
let's
audio?
do that actually. Let's turn Susan into a disembodied voice.
Hopefully we can.
All right, I'm going to. Whoops, she disappeared altogether.
I'm just kind of my understanding is like that the basic how did this all come about exactly?
So
how did it come out that that there was this hack?
It came out because okay, so she is now entirely disconnected from the system, which is assume she will return momentarily, and then we will bring her back. There she is. So it came out because the company FireEye noticed that it had been hacked and described, and in discerning the way it had been compromised, it discerned as well, it caused other entities to realize that they had been compromised too. So I think that's the mechanism, and it turns out it's a whole bunch of, federal government agencies, including, we just learned, the agency that controls the nuclear stockpile. Yeah, it's good stuff. So I have a serious point about this, which I made on Rational Security yesterday, but I think like some people may not have heard. I think we need to stop calling significant projects blank wind, where blank is a 2-syllable word starting with S and referring to space. We should just stop doing that.
Or like elements or fire or just like anything like solar, wind, fire, eye. Like, I don't know.
I mean, can't we call like a computer security system like Fred? Or
I don't know.
Like George? Oh, she's back. All right.
Hello.
So Susan, what I'm going to do is turn off your video so that you will just
Makes
be
sense.
audio, and so we won't be using as much of your bandwidth.
I'll miss
All right.
I'm in the
sweater,
wilds of
Susan.
Western Massachusetts.
Yeah, I have. Look, I do this show sometime from my cabin in the woods, and rural internet is a shanda, and so we totally get it. Anyway, I don't know how much of that you heard, but we were talking about how this came out. If FireEye hadn't gone public with its own hack, would we even know about this?
I think it would have taken a lot longer. For SolarWind not to tell the federal government would have made it liable for all sorts of things, including, I suspect, criminal penalties. Given the seriousness of what happened. Certainly, if SolarWind hadn't been public when it did come out, that would have been the end of its business. Whether it's the end of its business now is not clear. I'm hearing myself twice, by the way. How about you?
We're hearing you only once.
Great.
So if you can live with two of yourselves, we can live with it.
Good deal.
You probably have more than one window open with Crowdcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, you just close one of the windows.
Okay. So
what could have been done to prevent any of this? Is there anything very obvious from the
Oh
outset?
man,
Like,
what could have
yeah, a
been
lot.
done? So Einstein is a project from the 2010s, from before the 2010s. And, well, hold that for a moment. Biggest thing that happened is that they weren't monitoring what encrypted communications were coming out of federal agencies. Why should there be communications that are encrypted? Pay attention to them and look at where they're going, look who they're coming from, what time of day are they coming, and so on. Why wasn't that part of it? That should have been part of the Einstein project from early on, but certainly well past now. The Einstein project, I wrote about it with colleagues 2011, 2012. We're talking 8 years later, and that piece isn't part of it with the growing sophistication of the Russians. That's just crazy. That's just, that's inexcusable.
And how confident are you that this is an SVR operation?
The skill set, from what I've heard on the outside, and that's all I've heard, the skill set is such that it would not be the Chinese, unless the Chinese have made a sudden leap. It would not be the North Koreans. It would not be the Iranians. Could it be the British? Sure, it could be the British. Would the British do this? There's no argument for it.
Right.
Right. Right. I mean, the only reason for the British to do it is to show us that we're not as secure as we should be, and then they should have told us months ago. So the answer is this is the skill set of the Russians.
But you're confident it's not, you know, for example, people have been impressed with some of the recent Iranian operations directed against banking systems. I mean, everybody kind of assumes this is the Russians because it has their handwriting. But we don't have any direct forensic evidence of that, right?
So far we don't.
All right. So
the other part of it is, what advantage do the Iranians gain by the places they've gone into, except for planting false flag and making it appear that it's the Russians? But the agencies that have been gone into are much more advantageous to the Russians than to the Iranians. So the point is, when you're doing attribution, you look at all sorts of things. You look at, for the easy cases, you look at what time of day, during which holidays are people not active, and so on. For the more skilled ones, you're looking at motivation is a huge one. You look at skill, and those point much more to the Russians.
It's fair to say as well that this is this is not any Russians, right? So traditionally, we've kind of divided the Russians into the military intelligence people who are, you know, good, but they're mostly going to be doing phishing operations, a la, you know, the stuff that happened in 2016, and they're pretty noisy, versus the, you know, SVR people who are as good as they come and are very quiet. Is that fair?
That's fair. I think the fundamental mistake lies somewhere else. I can talk about Einstein, I can talk about the not monitoring, but I think the fundamental mistake we've made is, as we started moving to cybercom and so on, we just made the assumption that we were acres ahead. But this stuff is unfortunately not that hard. At least with our ability to secure systems, it's not that hard, or our inability to secure systems. And so we were overconfident at a time when we were way ahead. Now, I know that people in the government were very concerned in the 2000s about the problems in the private sector and the fact that the private sector wasn't sufficiently secure. But here we are in 2020, and it was not just the private sector that wasn't sufficiently secure. We knew that in the 2000s, but we didn't up the ante for the federal government to the level we should have.
And so what about Defend Forward? You know, we've all heard for the last 4 or 5 years that Defend Forward was a big step forward. Yeah, we can't protect our systems completely, but we can be in theirs in a persistent fashion so that when they do stuff, we know they're doing it, and we can take offensive operations by way of defense. And it seems like we were caught completely flat-footed here. So does defend forward suck, or is it just we're not doing enough of it?
We're not doing enough of it, but defend forward is not a new plan. If you go back to the Sony hack, which is 2014, you get the FBI and then President Obama saying it was the North Koreans. And you have all these computer security people saying, no, I don't believe them. How do they know that? They're just saying it. It's not true. And then there's this leak in January 2015, a disclosure that comes out of the Snowden leaks that says, one of the NSA people says, are there any fourth party routes? That is, we've hooked along on third party. How about any fourth party? And there's a response that says, yeah, there was this fifth party one where we hung along with the South Koreans, got into the North Korean networks, and then we did our own work in the North Korean networks ourselves, and we didn't have to go via the South Koreans. And that convinced all the people who were doubtful about the FBI and President Obama saying that, in fact, it was the North Koreans on Sony. Yes, we were in on North Korea already then. We've been doing that for a long time. But they only have to be lucky once. We have to be there all the time. I mean, it's the same thing you say about terrorists. They only have to succeed once.
All right. So now you are the incoming Biden administration. And I'm going to try to keep politics out of this question, but if my patent disgust comes through, you feel free to read into it whatever you like. You have an administration that you're replacing that 5 or 6 days into this mess has not bothered to say anything about it. Which of course raises, in retrospect, Helsinki questions, as well as, how the incumbent feels about Russian hacks of American systems.
My understanding is they're all done by 400-pound teenagers sitting in their parents' basement.
In New Jersey.
In New Jersey, right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I understand that, but if you're the incoming administration that has to, create a response where there is none 34 days from now, and has to imagine reestablishing deterrence where the current deterrence posture is, oh, they would never do that. How do you think about it? What's the... So... this is a little out of your area, but I'm curious for your thoughts on it. What's the... Put on your Dan Dresner hat, and what's the right answer to this question?
So, one answer
tell the Russians
is
to get the fuck out of our systems.
They were just spying. Spying's allowed. What's the OPM hack? We had the U.S. government saying, gee, we wish we could do it as well as they pulled it off there. So in some sense, they haven't done anything wrong. And it's we who've done something wrong by being so appallingly open, that is, not being able to find it much more quickly. That said, of course, there are tremendous numbers of things that the Russians have done in the last decade, all of which need responses to. That's one piece of the answer. So the real piece of the answer may be signaling to the Russians our capability. And we could signal it by doing something bad, or we could signal it by doing something, and now I'm scooping a paper that I'm in the middle of writing. We could signal it by doing something bad and then withdrawing it very quickly. Turn off all the lights and traffic lights in Moscow at, 1776 on July 4th for 30 seconds. Turn them back on. Make sure your code has been erased. Do we know who did it? Sure, we know who did it if it happens at 1776, which is actually, of course, 1816, whatever the right time is. But you understand the game I'm playing. Do a game where you signal you're within the system. Do it in places that either Putin knows, only Putin and people close in know, or do it in a place that's very public. That's one way to signal.
Turn
but
out the lights at the Kremlin only, but not at any hospital.
Right. Can we do that kind of signaling without causing damage? Sure we can. But of course, the other response is there's been all sorts of things that have happened over the last 4 years that we have, and longer than that, our failure to respond to Crimea, for example, that warrant response. And there's no reason that it needs to be response via cyber. We thought for a long time cyber attack, we have to respond by cyber. But somebody shoots out, drops a bomb from a plane. That doesn't mean you can't respond by naval.
No, go after their money in real estate in New York and London. I mean, that's where we can hurt them. And
that's right. And we hurt them in a bunch of different ways by doing that, because of course it removes support from Putin very quickly.
Kate?
Yeah. So no, I was going to say that actually just reminded me of exactly what Tomas Ilves was saying the other day, which was just basically like the best way to go after Russian oligarchs is to go after their money, and that's kind of the thing that's like missing. But I'm just I'm always confused every time there is one of these breaches, whether it's at a private corporation and there's a data breach like Equifax or something to that extent, or whether it's something like the SolarWinds thing. And I'm kind of just, it's interesting to me. It seems like any type of information in the wrong hands could be a weapon, whether it's private or classified or public information, or like, well, not if it's public, but like just basically like someone could hack a government worker's Facebook or Instagram account and like use something to blackmail them and to then get classified information. So like, I guess my question is,
I mean,
Susan, when you're
the Chinese have their OPM forms,
right?
They don't need their Facebook pages.
I mean, who can we place as spies in China now? We've knocked out people for 30 years.
So I guess my point is, Susan, like, is there anything like what is to be done in the future when we have all of this stuff, and so much of our information is online, some of it is hackable? What are like the biggest threats? Do they remain state secrets that are in kind of databases, or like kind of these like state held databases, or is just like is everything a potential database? Like if you could get into blackmail an individual to get into a database, that doesn't even seem like a cyber threat to me necessarily, if that makes sense.
If you're saying to me that when I want to say something negative about another person, do I send it an email or say, let's talk on the phone?
Right.
Of course I say, let's talk on the phone. It's something that Sony executives learned post-Sony hack. I don't know if they remembered it a year later because it's so easy to do email.
See, I do it on in lieu of fun, and and that's totally secure. So like no one will ever know because there's only like my closest friends watch this, and so there's only a few hundred people, and we don't think that any of them are Russian agents.
Yes.
I think you have to assume that anything you do online, anything you store in a database is likely to be compromised sooner or later. And so then what do you do about hiring people in delicate positions? It becomes a very different game than it used to be. And we're still learning to navigate that world. I don't have good answers because there aren't good answers. You try to avoid the people who have very easy things to blackmail, but how do you know about them? I don't have a good answer there, Kate.
Yeah, I mean, as we were talking about this with elliptically with Pete Strzok yesterday in our conversation or 2 days ago in our conversation about the legacy of John le Carré, but creating what they call in the industry a legend for somebody, which a background history. It's super hard now. Like, you like Pete was talking about how much attention is paid in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold to creating Alex Lemus's legend, right? His criminal record, his problems with the intelligence service that he was a member of, his firing, right? Like all of these things that are sort of set up. And I recently watched the Netflix miniseries about Eli Cohen, the Israeli spy in Syria in the mid-'60s, which is by the way, it's called The Spy, and if people haven't watched it, it's really quite well done by Sacha Baron Cohen. But the amount of time that show spends a whole episode on setting him up as a plausible Syrian businessman in Argentina before he ever goes to Syria. And you think about how difficult that would be now, to create a person, right? You can forge a birth certificate. It's really hard to forge a Facebook history.
Yeah.
Forget about a Facebook history. How are you going to forge the high school records and all the other pieces that are now so trivial to find?
Yes.
And it's.
Can I say how I think that you do it? And this is maybe a terrible thing to say, but I think that you do it by having someone with a very ubiquitous first and last name. Like if you have,
well, but they don't. But they also have to have a ubiquitous face, right?
Well, then I know, but then but then you take somebody. I think it ends up becoming a case you steal the identity of another individual, or something.
But now you want to steal the identity of somebody. A Ben Smith, who was born 40 years ago. But Ben Smith, who was born 40 years ago, has a history in photos. And you don't look like that Ben Smith. So you can say, yes, I was in a fire and I had an injury and this and that. But as Ben Wittes says, ain't so easy. I think it's actually pretty hard.
It's real. I mean, and of course, what it forces the intelligence services to do is to rely more on things that aren't human intelligence, that don't require, it's more on technical intelligence. And also more on, this is the part that people never talk about in Intel, which is, declaring who you are. So when Mark Polymeropoulos was on the show the other day, he said, I walked into FSV headquarters as a CIA guy. And then they attacked him with a microwave weapon, but that's a different matter. But to be based where you are under, basically not in cover at all, like as the sort of CIA station chief in such and such a place, declared and kind of doing your business. But, it puts a premium on the ability, save those situations where you're actually trying to create a legend for something, for those very rare situations where you actually need it.
Right. So I know that the CIA was worrying about this already a decade ago because the writing was on the wall. This is not a problem that's new to them now.
More? What do you mean that they were worried specifically about the difficulty of ever building legends for people in the future?
That's right.
Okay.
If everybody's online all the time, it's impossible to make legends. So if you go back to the last of the Carla books, the Smiley's people, where the sort of theme that they kind of figure out what Carla's doing, he's creating a legend for a girl, right? And this turns out to be his daughter. He's trying to get mental health care for his daughter, right? So he has to create a whole identity for this young woman, and it is by tracing the legacy that they're able to figure out what he's up to. You couldn't do that today. Create a fake persona for somebody in a different country and install them in a mental health care facility. Right? So this is only 40 years ago, and it's completely unimaginable that you could do this today. So let's talk about going dark, Susan. I think you get. Are you taking a victory lap
Susan
these
is
days?
literally dark right now.
Let's bring her in so that people don't think she. So there she is. She's really here. Let's should we risk leaving you up on video?
Let's try and see what happens.
Right.
You'll either cut me off when I say something you don't like, or
no.
I like your sweater, Susan. It's very festive.
Well, thank you. It's cold in Massachusetts.
I'm also in Massachusetts.
So am I?
I didn't realize that, Kate.
So are you basically declaring victory at this point? So for those of you who don't know, Susan has been arguing for some time that the solution to the problem of going dark, that is of inability to access encrypted communications on devices and in transit, but particularly on devices, which is the majority of the problem for law enforcement, is to get good at hacking devices. And there have been some pretty substantial, interesting news stories recently that the FBI and a couple of contractors have gotten pretty damn good at hacking devices, and that I don't say the going dark problem is going away, but that it is a little bit less acute than people like me thought it was 5 or 6 years ago. Is that a fair summary of the situation, Susan?
Well, yes and no. Yes, you believe it's less acute than you felt it was 6 years ago, because I want to say you were fooled by them. So the thing is, I thought the going dark problem was, I thought the encryption problem was going away in the late 1990s when the NSA said, yeah, go ahead and export everything. You don't need a license as long as you're not selling to another government or to a communications provider or building custom software, hardware. You can export without a license. And I figured we were going to have strong encryption everywhere, and that just didn't happen. It took till early 2010s before it began to appear. But the whole time between 2000 and the early 2010s, the FBI was fussing is probably the word I want to say, because we're in lieu of fun. Just objecting and saying that it was going to go dark. They were not going to be able to do anything. So what happens now? We have two things. Thing one is that Upturn produces this report that says 2,000 out of the 18,000 U.S. police forces. So why does the U.S. have 18,000 police forces? Because we're talking state, local, federal, and tribal. But 2,000 out of the 18,000 police forces have access to tools that can open phones. That sounds like only 1/9, except it's the large police forces. So 50 of the largest police forces. So it's a lot more than 2,000 in that sense. It's a much higher percentage. But then we have in Europe and in the US all this talk about child porn, which of course pulls at everybody. And nobody wants to argue that police should be hampered from opening phones because of child porn. And so I don't declare victory laps because I think we're not going to see this disappear.
It's interesting.
So now you two have disappeared from my screen.
We're here.
Do you want to disappear me so that I can see you again, or how do you want to do this?
Sure.
It's more important to have voices than faces.
You guys
we
there?
are here.
Ben, I'm sorry for a stupid question, but what do you mean by going dark and specifically?
So going dark is a law enforcement term that refers to the inability to access lawfully acquirable data because of encryption.
Okay. So we're just talking are we talking end to end or any type of encryption? But specifically what Susan's talking about, specifically around child pornography, that has been linked the biggest thing I would think is end to end encryption.
Well, so
right?
there's several issues. There's the issue of and Susan is blinked out again. So I will say this at risk of
I knew the term going dark, you just kind of go off the radar, you disappear. Like,
No.
generally,
That's a different use of the term. So going dark in this context is a term synonymous with the sort of crypto wars.
Got it. Okay. I don't know why
it is the concern by law enforcement that they will not be able to access data to which they are lawfully entitled in a form that is actually useful.
Right.
And I have always believed that that there are basically people who are talking past one another, sometimes intentionally and sometimes because they just speak different languages in this. To me, it's never been obvious what the right answer is, except that you want to do as little in the compulsion department as you possibly can in order to retain as much access to as much material as you can. And so to me, this story is great in the sense that to the extent that the problem is less acute than, a lot of investigators felt it was and still feel it is, that's just an uncomplicatedly good thing as far as I'm concerned. Susan, I don't know how much of that you were able to hear.
Just the tail end of it, but I think what I'm saying with what you're saying, I wildly agree with.
Now
Europe is responding differently. Europe is talking again about exceptional access, partially driven by the Brits, and perhaps partially driven by U.S. law enforcement, which has been pushing all around the world.
Right. So the U.S. having figured out that they cannot that they cannot get anything through Congress that they would want, are very interested in British law enforcement as the stalking horse here. And there is a, so help me out, Susan. What is the part of the problem that remains? I mean, so when I talk to, it is like the core of it is sex crimes investigators, not just child porn, but when I did my study of sextortion cases, there were, the sextortion the people who prosecute these cases feel encumbered by, it's interesting, some companies and not others, right? Like there's a reason why the sextortionists love Kick Messenger, or at least did a few years ago when I was doing this work. And don't love Facebook, actually. Like it's people have a lot of nasty things to say about Facebook, but this isn't one of them. And so I guess my question is, what is the part of the issue that remains, and that's where you expect to have to continue to fight on this?
So I think it can go in a bunch of different ways. One piece, of course, is the integration of WhatsApp, Messenger, and Instagram. And one can view that, and I think appropriately so, as a potential antitrust case. And that's the view for lots of reasons that make sense to me. One can view this as problems for law enforcement investigators. That's one piece of the problem. Another piece of the problem, another way to look at the problem is the child porn. Where exactly does the problem lie? And none of us like to start thinking about that. What I'm told by people who work in this area is that the porn and the abuse of children has gotten noticeably worse.
Yep.
Over the last 10, 15 years. But is the problem the people who consume and support the industry in quotes, or is it the people who produce the horrible stuff? And of course, the answer is really the latter. And the former is the easy group to find and prosecute. And there seems to be a fair bit of evidence that indicates that the former group, the consumers, they're consuming stuff that we find horrendous, but it's not clear that they do other damage. They're supporting a really terrible industry, but it's not clear that they go out or that a very large percentage of them go out and harm children. And if that's the case, shouldn't we be focusing on the people who produce, who are much harder to investigate? Those guys are smart. They use all sorts of encryption and all sorts of things. They're not going to be easy to find.
So I totally agree with you that as an enforcement priority matter, you want to focus on the people who are producing, not the people who are consuming. But I guess I don't want to romanticize or overstate the line between the two, because a bunch of these sites have, you have to contribute original material to get access to the site kind of requirements.
Right, and that's what's been driving the really horrible stuff.
Yeah, so I've been at a number of, so it's very interesting also, by the way, Susan, and I at some point I would love to hear about your path to working in this area, and like kind of how you got here and built your expertise. I've come to end-to-end encryption through content moderation and online and private platforms, kind of online, censorship or online kind of curation of users' content. And then, of course, like for a while when that was happening, it became so that you could, NCMEC had its database, you could do one-to-one matching with photo DNA. That was a huge breakthrough. But then as things move, people go dark and they go into these end-to-end encryption, into these end encryption platforms. I would say that like in the meetings that I've been in with NCMEC and the FBI and other types of places, the conversation is shockingly not around finding just the bad actors who are creating this, and like actually seeing the entire network of sharing as its own unique harm to victims. Mostly in perpetuating kind of these images of them that are kind of always constantly shared on, like that are shared, and that they believe like the idea that knowing that those pictures or those videos or whatever are out there is a constant kind of it's a constant harm to them every time that happens. I guess I just don't see a good. There's no, like, one of the caveats of all of the meetings that I'm in is like that we are not allowed to talk back doors. But I don't understand how you even begin to address some of these problems without talking about that. And also, one of the things that I'd be interested in this is like the benefits of end-to-end encryption in order for political protest and in places that have more authoritarian regimes. And of course, like the conversations I've been having is like, yes, there's this historic spike in sharing of child pornography, but also there's this historic moment in Hong Kong, and there's this all of these kind of historic moments happening in India. And so like, do you have any kind of feelings about like where the right balance should be struck right now with those types of kind of conflicting
Well,
goals?
Susan's not a balance person on
Right.
this issue.
So
No, I know,
Kate, let me answer you. I will disarm Ben with the following. I'll say this is not a security versus privacy issue. It's really a security versus security issue. It's a security versus efficiency of law enforcement investigations issue. Just think about the situation we've been in since March, where we all of us are working, or not all of us, those of us who can are working from home. What we need to be able to work safely and securely for many jobs is to have consumer grade, high quality encryption on consumer equipment. And that's true for all of us. There's a wonderful post by Jim Baker in Lawfare, I want to say about a year and a month ago. Sorry?
I said he's a turncoat.
He saw the light. My good friend Jim saw the light.
I hate it when these former bureau people come out and outflank me from the left.
Maybe you got to move, Ben.
Yeah.
I actually, the funny thing is people think they know my actual views of this issue. I don't know. I hosted Jim Comey to present his views at Brookings, and I thought that Apple's read of the law was wrong, and that but I actually don't know. I've never known what I think the right the right policy is on this. And I don't like. My view is Lawfare should host the debate. That's my real view of it.
Ben, you just didn't take my book to heart.
I did have you on the podcast, though.
You did, and you were incredibly gracious and asked really smart and interesting questions, and it was wonderful. But to get back to Kate's question, I think well, let me start with what Jim had to say. Jim had to say, look, we're communicating all the time over insecure networks, and he pointed it to Huawei in particular. And we now know that the Chinese have been hacking from the Caribbean, I believe, is the latest one, and listening into phone communications. The point is our whole signaling infrastructure is insecure in lots of different ways. And there's lots of information. You talked earlier about blackmail. There's lots of information we pass to each other, whether it's personal information, professional information, business information. We need to have that secure. Now, you could argue, should we do it via somewhere where the keys are escrowed? And then you get into the issue that when you escrow the keys, you've created a rich source for somebody to break in. And that's the argument we had back in the 1990s about Clipper. At the time, the National Academies produced a report that said, hey, we don't think this is necessarily where you want to go. But if you want to go there, then the first thing you ought to do is build an escrow system at scale and see how well it works. And that never happened. What we said in the Carnegie report a year ago is, easiest thing to test is to test whether or not there's a solution that opens phones that still provides security to people whose phones are not in the hands of law enforcement and if you can come up with a technical solution that satisfies the principles we're asking for, then let's think about a law. Let's not do it backwards. My friend Matt Plays had the right line. When you ask about exceptional access, you're asking to be able to land a person on the sun and then bring them back safely. But what we said in the Carnegie report is, okay, let's throw out two straw mans. Straw man number one is that law enforcement won't be able to function unless it can open phones and listen into conversations. And two, we don't know that it's impossible to come up with some sort of exceptional access solution. So let's let research flourish. If there's research, don't say it can't be done. Try it. If there's a viable solution that works at scale, you can't do a solution that works in some toy example. You have to really work at scale and see whether or not it really works at scale. Then you come up with the laws.
All right, Alice, the floor is yours. Will your audio work today?
Let's see. Does it sound like it's working?
It does.
Whoa,
little bit of a lag. Your lips move before we get the sound, but that's not too bad.
Okay. Hi, Susan.
Hi.
So my question was, so I work in tech, and what gets my goat the way nothing else does that I hear from law enforcement occasionally, or when I interact with them, which is not super often, is they seem to think that it's actually a phrase. Is, when you kind of say, okay, how would you answer this particular question in respect to lawful access? The answer is often, well, there are really smart people in Silicon Valley. And it drives me up the wall because this is a conversation we actually need to have together. But that's such a conversation ender. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for how to kind of pull back that conversation and say, no, we're not done here.
I want to tell you the history of that phrase.
Please do.
Ben, are you responsible for it?
Well, no, but
people in Silicon Valley phrase?
Yeah, well,
there are really smart people in Silicon Valley.
They can figure this out.
We'll pass a law, and we'll get all of the communications that are represented.
I think that phrase comes from Comey at Brookings in the event that I hosted for him.
So it is your fault.
And, in the convening sense. So, and I think, if I'm wrong here, what Jim will tell me, but I think what Jim was trying to say was, hey, I am not a computer scientist. I am a law enforcement guy. I'm trying to describe a performance standard, and I don't know how to implement it. But that's not my job. My job is to tell you what I need and what the consequences are if I don't get it. And I don't think it was meant to be a conversation stopper. I think it was meant to be a conversation starter. And as was that entire, like, if you go listen to the event that we had, I think what Jim was trying to do is say, look, we're running up against a real problem here. And Susan will say, you know, they've always been saying that, and the problem has never been here. But I know Jim was being quite sincere in that moment,
and he wanted to take that seriously. But
he wanted to start a conversation about how to address it. Now, there may be plenty of reasons to think he was coming into a conversation that had been going on for 15 or 20 years as though it were starting. But I don't think the goal of it was to be like, let's crush this conversation like a bug. I think the goal of it was, hey, I've got a lot of agents with a lot of phones that we don't know what to do with. And some of them are in really, really crucial high stakes cases. And I think if he'd known they were going to break the San Bernardino phone, he probably wouldn't have done it then, you know, like just, anyway, that's my background to your question. But Susan, what are your thoughts?
When they say this and that they get the answer back, we don't know how to do this. This is not a plausible question. And then they say it again. It seems like that's rhetoric rather than a serious a response. Now, that doesn't mean that Jim Comey didn't mean it seriously when he asked the first time. I know that when I didn't go because I know that I don't get listened to, but some of the Carnegie people, the people who worked on the Carnegie report, went to talk to DOJ and said, well, you know, you could do X that would take care of this piece of the problem, and you could do Y that would take care of this piece of the problem. And DOJ's response was, we want something that'll solve the entire problem. We're not interested in biting off pieces. Now that sounds like rhetoric again, rather than a serious attempt to get at an answer.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I think there is a big difference between what Barr has been doing on this issue and what the Obama administration was doing on this issue. Barr seems to me like he's primarily thumping his chest. And, you know, the Obama administration had a pretty elaborate interagency process that Bob Litt ran out of the ODNI to try to kind of figure, and they never actually came up with a position, which suggests to me that they weren't primarily being belligerent about it. They had 10 different agencies with a lot of different equities in the question. Do you think that's fair? Or
I do.
Am I being too nice to them?
No. I think that's actually right. And I realize I'm talking the Carnegie report, and most people won't know what I'm talking about.
It's a great report.
Thank you. It's called Moving the Encryption Conversation Forward. It was convened by Obama's former chief of staff, Dennis McDonough and Ed Felton, who had been in OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy. And people on the committee included Chris Inglis, who was the former deputy director at NSA, Avril Haines, who was former deputy director at CIA and has been nominated for a director of national intelligence, Jim Baker, who was FBI general counsel during the San Bernardino case. And we came out with this report that said, okay, try first if there's a technical solution, first to the locked phones, and then if you can do it, come up with a law. So I would say that, yeah, it's a pretty different position than Barr has taken, and I would agree with the chest thumping and the lack of seriousness.
Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Professor Landau, for being on. This is really great.
Thank you.
My question is, well, first of all, it just boggles my mind that the Russians were able to pull off such a massive hack successfully. And so my question, really two questions. How much of this was due to software vulnerabilities, and how much of this was due to social engineering? And going forward, if you were to prioritize these, what do you think deserves the most immediate attention, the software vulnerabilities or the social engineering?
So the answer, so I suspect that there was a vulnerability, possibly a 0-day. I haven't heard anything anybody said so far about social engineering. That doesn't mean that wasn't the case, but I think we would have heard it already. The answer to your question about social engineering versus vulnerabilities, I think it depends on what kind of software, what kind of situation you're talking about. If you're talking about a large public-facing entity, it's going to be much more prone to social engineering because the people who are working the back desks have to work with people all the time, and they have to accommodate people. If you're talking about a company that is very little public-facing, then social and people who are highly technically trained, they typically are not going to get, click on the link and so on and so forth, deal with the spear phishing and so on. So it really depends on where you look. I will add, not because you asked me about this, but because it fits in nicely, and it's one of my pet peeves. Educate the user is the wrong solution. So when we talk about social engineering, we say, the user didn't know not to fall for that. But much of educate the user is putting too much burden on the user and not enough on the people who are designing the systems.
David Botts, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I do have presents for both Ken and Bate.
Ken and Bate? Excellent. I think we're going to go with that. Let's bring you up on the full screen so that we can see. There's Nina and Ziva.
Indeed.
Wow. Ziva is Maggie's dog.
Oh, that is a very cute dog.
I'm gonna take a screenshot of this to send to Maggie because she'll be very moved.
So excited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, your question, sir.
So,
Hi, friend.
Professor Landau, given the significant level of automation and dependence on computers in the United States, how should we plan for and respond to adversaries who don't have the same vulnerabilities? So we live in a glass house, right? How do we think through that?
So now you're asking me to be in both state and DoD and respond to somebody who has done a gray zone attack below the level of war. And that's going to depend on where their vulnerabilities are. Sanctions of the right sort, talking to our allies and preventing trade of certain sorts, stopping buying their oil and using oil from elsewhere. It really depends on where the vulnerabilities of that adversary lie. But there is no reason at all that we have to respond by cyber. Oh, now you want me to get both my old dog and my puppy, but I can't hold them both at the same time.
No, I didn't want to distract you. Sorry, Susan. I was just trying to leave on a high note since we're looking at cute dogs.
No, I'm really enjoying my two, except when they get into the puppy dropping stuff in front of the old dog and saying, "Play with me now."
That's a pretty adorable classic dynamic.
All right. That brings us to 6 o'clock, which means we should wrap up. Susan Landau, we haven't even had a chance to talk to you about what you've actually been working on the past 9 months, which is, as I understand it, contact tracing and the associated problems therein. Is that right? That's right.
It was partially an accident and almost entirely your fault, Ben. So the accident was that I believe I had COVID. I wasn't tested at the time because we weren't testing people who hadn't been to China, who weren't around somebody who'd been to China. And the symptoms I showed at that point, CDC said were a severe cold. Later, new symptoms came out that I'd had that indicated it was probably COVID. And because I live in Western Massachusetts, where there wasn't much testing for antibodies and nobody was going to use plasma, I didn't get tested that way either. That was not your fault. The part that is your fault is running.
I'm really trying to figure out where I get blamed for this.
Yeah. It's
Just
lawfare. So I was on a call early on in COVID that CDT had organized. And somebody was talking about tracking people using GPS, and I thought, wait a minute, GPS isn't really good because the disease spreads indoors and GPS doesn't work indoors. So I did a blog post for lawfare.
Indeed,
and then
you did.
And then I started talking about efficacy, and I did another blog post for lawfare. And then one of the outcomes for me of the Carnegie Report was that some people at the Carnegie Report, Christy Lopez and Harlan Lieu and Laura Moy, had talked some about equity. And
I love Laura. She's so great.
Absolutely. And so I ended up doing a piece with Laura and Christy on equity and contact tracing. And when MIT was interested in a book on contact tracing apps, I thought, well, they wanted a short book on contact tracing apps. I've done 3 lawfare pieces. How hard is it to write a book?
Right.
Ask the
Famous
dog and the
last
puppy
words,
later. So that's how I ended up doing it. The book will be out in April. It's called People Count, Contact Tracing Apps and Public Health. And in answer to one question that went by in the chat, the symptoms I had that convinced me I had it were one, that I'd lost sense of taste and smell before I started my cold 24 hours before. And the second was that I thought I had conjunctivitis at around the same time because my eyes were bothering me, but I didn't. That my eyes kept bothering me. And it turned out that burning eyes is another unusual symptom, but symptom of COVID. And so that's what convinced me. But it's all your fault, Ben.
Thank you. Well, speaking of my fault, we should have you back.
Any guests that blame everything on you as they sign up on the show.
Yeah, that seems right. Well, Susan's been blaming me for things for a long time, so that seems appropriate. And I blame her for every crime that takes place in the United States. So it's kind of an even thing. So let's have you back to have a focused conversation next week on the contact tracing stuff, which warrants an hour by itself. Does that make sense?
Sure. The latter part of the week, I'm going to be somewhere with even less good internet activity. So it's either early part next week or the following.
Have you worked? Sorry.
No, go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to ask really quickly if you'd worked with Jonathan Zittrain on any of this stuff, because I know he was working on contact tracing stuff, and he does a lot of stuff with MIT and other places.
No, but I
maybe
did.
Not.
Hewlett did a talk today, a session for people who had Hewlett grants, and one of the people working for Jay-Z was on it, Margaret Bardot, and she was terrific.
She's great. Okay, great, cool. That would be really fun if both of you came back on, and you're both in Western Mass, so.
All right, so tomorrow, continuing our cybersecurity theme, Mika Ouyang is joining us to talk about cyber enforcement, and I will be playing the role of the cyber enforcement skeptic, though I am only sort of in fact one in real life. And that will be 22 hours and 55 minutes from now. It'll be episode 267. I want to say we have magically passed into the last 100 days of our first year of doing this every goddamn day. So that'll be tomorrow. Susan Landau, you're a great American, even if we can't see you. And we will have you back to talk contact tracing soon. And until then, we don't have fun anymore because fun is not allowed.
Well, then I'll just go play with my dogs.
Yeah, but we do have dogs, and we have contact tracing
Susan,
apps,
I really want
even
to
if
see
they
what
don't
your
work
dogs look like.
quite right yet.
And
Hold
The
on, I'll get
message on
the big one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so quickly, Ben, can we see her dog, please?
Yeah. So here is.
Yeah. Ah. Oh. Is that a big poodle? That's beautiful.
It's like a giant standard poodle.
Yeah, is that a big standard poodle?
Excellent. And it
Oh
is
my God.
definitely a big standard poodle.
Yes, what a good boy.
She's the older dog.
Oh,
She is
she's so
beautiful.
sweet.
What's her name?
Beautiful.
Her name is Zosha, and that's because our kids who had left for college didn't like any of the names we came up with. So after we'd gone through all the American names we could think of, we went through Polish names. We got to Zosha, they said fine, and we said good because we couldn't, and we would have had to think of another
That was when we were
language.
on Z. Yes, exactly. Ben,
Well,
you have a dog with you at all times when you wear your dog.
that's why I wear dog shirt. No, because my dogs are so hyperactive that if they were in here, it would be a mess. All right,
Well,
we're gonna wrap up.
Susan,
Great to
I'm
see
so
you,
glad to
Susan.
finally meet you.